We are moving on to item 8A, the Housing and Human Concerns Committee Housing Policy Recommendations. This dates back to a tremendous amount of work that was done by our Housing and Human Concerns Committee, working with the community to develop some recommendations. And we had a robust study session with the HHCC. The council had a tremendous amount of discussion, and then it comes back to us tonight to make some formal recommendations. Before tonight's presentation, I did want to acknowledge the work of the Housing and Human Concerns Committee. Are there members here? I know some of them are here. So if you're here stand up. Thank you. We got back there. Thank you for your hard work. I'm sure the others. Thank you for being here tonight. This is a directional and informational item. As these things, as we give comments, will come back in formal action before us. But tonight will be just some clarifying on the recommendations that we made back in. Well, I'm sure we'll hear in a minute when that meeting was. I think it was in October, if I remember correctly. So, thank you for doing that. And with that, I believe that looks like Mr. Ackman, our Assistant City Manager, will begin the staff report.
Thank you, and good evening, Honorable Mayor and City Council. I'll briefly go over how we got here today, as well, and then turn it over to our consultant who's been leading the HHCC process. As the Mayor mentioned, this is a process that started a little bit over a year ago in February 2016 when we had the Managing Growth Study Session. At that, affordable housing policy was one of the main direction that we got as staff, and the Council tasked the Housing and Human Concerns Commission with hosting a series of community meetings as well as HHCC meetings and come back to the Council with policy recommendations. Those meetings occurred in May through September of last year, and there was a joint study session with HHCC and the Council in October of last year. At that time, there were 9 conceptual policy recommendations put forward to the Council. And we were set in 3 different categories, some that we wanted to move forward with right away, a middle category that we wanted to have HHCC do additional research, and then a third category where we didn't want to move forward at this time. The recommendations that came from that middle category to do additional research and come back to the Council with specific policy recommendations were related to strengthening our relocation ordinance, looking at a minimum lease term ordinance, as well as looking at an inclusionary housing ordinance. And that's what occurred since that time. We've brought on Baird and Driscoll consultants. They're a very knowledgeable consultant firm that's helped San Mateo County through the last 2 planning housing cycles, and have done a good job pulling together policies from different cities that we could potentially use as a template here in Redwood City. So at this time, I'll turn it over to Jeffrey Baird, who is a principal with Baird and Driscoll.
Thank you, Aaron.
Hello, Mayor and members of the Council. We're very happy to be here and to be the medium to convey the Housing and Human Concerns Committee's recommendations to you. I need my glasses so I can see what my notes say. Yeah, as Aaron mentioned, Josh Abrams and I work with 21 Elements, which I think you all are aware of, where we've worked with collaboratively with all the jurisdictions in the county. And so it's very much a pleasure for us to work on projects with individual cities and to be able to bring that knowledge, but also to get into the details and to create products that are really tailored to each community's use and needs. We looked at the 3 issues that Aaron mentioned: minimum lease terms, which is also known as right to lease, tenant relocation assistance, and then inclusionary zoning. Just as an aside related to the inclusionary zoning, the committee recommended that the inclusionary zoning ordinance not be pursued at this time for a couple of reasons. One is there's a bit of flux in terms of legal challenges, as well as state law fixes to how inclusionary zoning is used in the state. I think also the committee felt that they were seeing successes from the actions that the city has taken, whether it's related to impact fees or others, that are actually producing units that you would get through inclusionary zoning. So I think there was the recommendation to kind of wait and see and not move forward at this particular time in terms of inclusionary zoning. My presentation will then cover basically the two other topics that we covered. The initial part of the work entailed the collection of best practices, comparison with what other cities are doing. We also utilized extensive amount of work that's been undertaken by 21 Elements looking at strategies to address the issue of tenant displacement. And I know it's an extremely controversial topic, but it's also an extremely critical topic to look at. And so I actually really commend this community looking at those issues. We used an extensive amount of work that has been done by 21 Elements on these strategies, and as well as other materials that are available through the Bay Area sources. It was very hard for us to find an exact match, and I know you were looking at comparative cities, so we kind of took a little potpourri of matches to see to help the Housing and Human Concerns Committee go through the discussion on these topics and to understand kind of the implications and what's working in other communities, what might not be working, and what could be applicable to Redwood City. And just by way of an example, there are many cities that include tenant relocation assistance, but in most cases it's tied to or included in those cities that have rent stabilization or rent control or just cause for eviction ordinances. So they kind of come under this big umbrella that's protecting tenants and have a framework then to be applied. What we had to come up with was basically standalone ordinances that would work independent of anything else. The two jurisdictions that provided the best comparable information actually were nearby, Mountain View and Menlo Park. And so we have talked to staff at both those jurisdictions to see how those ordinances are working and to provide you with good feedback on what might be state-of-the-art best practice for Redwood City. We also followed up a lot with the Housing and Human Concerns Committee's questions related to options or problems or successes, things like that. So there was a lot of research that went into this work. So with that, I just want to kind of walk through with you the recommendations of the HHCC and then answer any questions you might have. In terms of the factors that the committee felt were important as it related to minimum lease terms was to provide tenants with stability, more stability than they currently have, as well as recognizing the need for flexibility between the tenant and the landlord and coming up with maybe another agreement that can fit both their needs. The committee didn't want to impact or create an impediment to accessory dwelling units, so that was another consideration. There also is no constraints on landlords raising rents. So just to be very clear on that, that is part of the committee's recommendation that when a lease expires, landlords still have the freedom to raise rents or decrease rents as they want. The other factor that came up through our discussions is concern about the differences between what might be considered mom and pop landlords, the smaller landlords, as compared to the larger developments that might have more capacity, if you will, to absorb the cost or or even staffing and time implications of implementing these type of requirements. We did follow up with the city of Mountain View because they recently rescinded their relocation ordinance. And just to go through that, the city, by voter approval, adopted rent stabilization and just cause. And because of that, there were some conflicts then with their relocation and with their minimum lease term requirements. So that was one of the reasons they rescinded the ordinance. But they also received some comments back from both landlords and tenants. Tenant comments were that they also wanted to, in the Mountain View ordinance, the landlord is required to offer either a 1-year or a 6-month lease to the tenant, and tenants wanted to also have a requirement that the landlord offer a month-to-month lease as well, so that there's kind of a stable of choices in there for that the landlord must offer the tenants that the tenants can choose from. There's also the flexibility for the two to come to a mutual agreement on some other term or whatever, but that specific addition was an issue that came up in Mountain View. For landlords, there was feedback from the smaller landlords in terms of the paperwork required of minimum lease terms. So it's, again, that goes back to the kind of the capacity issues and the critical mass to kind of cover costs. So in terms of the minimum lease terms, the length of these are all recommendations of the Housing and Human Concerns Committee. The length recommended is to require either a 1-year or 6-month option for the tenant, and that must be provided. That choice must be provided by the landlord. That the tenant and landlord can agree on other timeframes, and it's required to be offered each time the lease is renewed. So under that length of minimum lease requirements, you may want to consider direction in adding a month-to-month as well, since that was the feedback from Mountain View. The committee has not reviewed that, but that's just the feedback we've received. In terms of minimum project size, the committee recommends 3 or more units. So in other words, from 3 up would be required, landlords would be required to offer the 1-year or 6-month lease. In Menlo Park, their ordinance starts at 5 or more. So again, that may be some consideration of the mom and pop impacts, but then that becomes a consideration here of kind of protecting or preserving tenants' ability to stay in their home or have more stability versus, who that and how much that impacts landlords. In terms of exemptions, this is kind of a standard list that actually is in both ordinances. Again, part of the recommendation was to avoid impacting second units and other, the small landlords. And then finally, that the committee, want to make it clear that the landlord can increase the rent at the end of the lease period. It's not an impediment to any whatever the landlord wants to do rent-wise. I'm just going to keep moving through both of these, if that's okay. In terms of the factors related to relocation assistance, I think the concern was about primarily about the impact on lower income. In other words, households earning less than 80% of median income, of having the most challenging time finding replacement housing, especially in our local housing market. And also, again, not impacting the mom and pop landlords. I think in the case of relocation assistance, it's because there's a monetary aspect to it. They wanted to have a critical size that could then cover the relocation assistance. In addition, I think we've had some discussion of how relocation assistance can provide, to a degree, well, it's not directly a strategy to address displacement of tenants per se. It can act as an impediment, if you will, or a decision-making factor in, a tenant being displaced, and so there was a consideration of that as well. And then finally is I think the kind of the driver in this was providing an opportunity for lower income households who work in a lot of the jobs to be able to stay local and find housing locally. In our conversations with Mountain View, they still have the relocation assistance in place, although it's been modified a little bit to be consistent with rent stabilization and other requirements, but they've had very good success with it, and so they have not found that to be a problem, like as they did with getting the feedback on the minimum lease terms ordinance. So, in terms of the content requirements, it would be it would apply to any rental unit on properties of, again, the recommendation is on properties of 5 or more units. The landlord and the committee felt it was also, and the ordinance themselves as well, felt it important to specifically identify those actions, if you will, that precipitate the relocation assistance, because there still are actions that a tenant can do that would break a lease, or where the landlord still has remedies to remove a tenant, and should under state law and do under state law. So these would be circumstances that would be different from circumstances that are covered under current regulations or which a landlord operates under. So the exemptions include mobile homes and compliance with enforcement orders and others that are very specific. In a sense, it does create, if you will, a quote-unquote no-fault kind of situation for the tenant. But there still are circumstances where, say, the rent's increased or other actions are taken where the tenant, has a choice, but can be displaced. One exemption that was included is, and that the committee talked about, was exempting a landlord from relocation assistance when they provide temporary where it's a temporary displacement, say for remodeling or something like that, where the landlord can provide alternative housing nearby, on site or nearby, to enable that kind of flexibility when those circumstances exist, so that the tenant can move back in. Eligible households, there was a lot of discussion about this, and the committee decided that 80% of area median income or low income should be kind of the cap for the relocation assistance to be required. Amount, we had a lot of discussion about the amount and what's included. And the committee's recommendation is to include the base package, basically, if someone is eligible, would be 3 months rent. Median market rent would have to be determined through some methodology. Refund of security deposit, obviously after anything is needed to be taken out, and a 60-day subscription to a rental agency. In addition, the committee added another month to cover people with special needs households, as well as people who've lived in the community or in that unit longer. So there's a 1-month addition for households who have lived in their unit for 5 or more years, so some way to verify that would have to be included. And then households 62 years of age or older, so that'd be senior households, as people with living with disabilities, or households with 1 or more children. Again, still under the 80% median income cap for this program. And then again, for the temporary, and these are just some other things that the committee wanted to make sure were in there. One is related to the temporary relocation that I mentioned earlier. Also providing the tenant, if it is a temporary displacement, if you will, or relocation, to give the tenant at least a first right of returning to the unit after the work has been done, even though the rents may be higher. At least give the tenant who was living there a first choice. And then any other, special circumstances related to city code and other things. So that concludes my presentation on these 2 items. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, if we'll get to council questions and comments together. This is not a public hearing, but I do have 2 speakers cards, so I'd like to get to those at this time. Thank you. And I'm sure you'll be back up to answer questions in a minute, so don't go very far. But I do have 2 speakers cards, and so I'd like to take those now. The first speaker is Cesar Gonzalez, followed by Chris Johnson.
Council. The HHCC report highlights the fact that renters expressed last year concern over gouging rent rises and no-fault evictions. If Redwood City is committed to alleviate the pain in the community, it has to look no further than Mountain View. Last year, they ran a wonderful campaign, successful campaign, to enact rent stabilization and just cause eviction in their communities. Otherwise, a moratorium on rent increases and relocation assistance triggered by no-fault eviction are the most meaningful ideas the city can adopt. The city has to realize that these are not solutions, these are bandages. We have an affordability crisis. How high must the impact fees be before the city is affordable? How long must the minimum lease be until the city is affordable? Right now, we're just building really market rate units. Some percentage of units affordable here, maybe an affordable project here or there. We need a lot more housing. How many units must be built until the city is affordable? And if that even translates to landlords knocking on tenants' doors, telling them that their rent's gone down. The city has to be bolder than this. It can't shy away from rent stabilization and just cause. As alluded earlier, the state has withdrawn funding for redevelopment. We're not building enough. There's nothing left. If the city is serious at addressing this issue, it has to think about housing for the many, not the few. Thank you.
Chris Johnson.
Good evening. Thank you, Cesar, for starting a conversation on renter protections. My name is Chris Johnson. I'm a 17-year resident of Redwood City. I'd like to start out by thanking the volunteers of the HHCC. I attended 2 of the meetings on the subject of renter protections and housing production, and there's no questioning their dedication and compassion on the subject of housing policy. Given the displacement and gentrification that is running rampant through our city right now, I find this staff report incredibly underwhelming. This has nothing to do with the HHCC and their efforts. This has everything to do with what our city decided to focus on. The 2 most important ways to combat combat displacement were not even studied, and that's rent stabilization and no-cause evictions. The fact that our HHCC was directed to not evaluate either of these two options is failing the hundreds, if not thousands, of people who are being evicted every month. We were late to the game to begin with, and then we waited 16 months for this report, and all we got were 2 recommendations, 1 on minimum lease terms and 2 on possible relocation assistance. Once again, it's shocking that this staff report fails to even mention rent stabilization and just cause eviction. We didn't publicly study these issues, so how can we decide as a community whether they were going to be effective? This isn't black magic I'm talking about. There are plenty of Bay Area cities that have already enacted renter stabilization, including Mountain View, San Jose, Richmond, Hayward, San Francisco, Berkeley, Los Gatos, and East Palo Alto. On top of that, there are also many cities that have already enacted no-cause eviction protections. Mountain View, San Jose, Richmond, Hayward, San Francisco, Berkeley, Los Gatos, Alameda, and East Palo Alto. If all these cities can do this, what is stopping us other than the will of council? It's no coincidence that evictions have spiked since the DTPP was adopted. Not only did we create zoning and a streamlined approval process like the Downtown Persuasive Plan that exacerbated displacement, but we have failed in those 6 years to come up with a game plan that will have a significant impact on the renters who face chronic housing uncertainty in Redwood City. I truly hope that we can start putting the same amount of effort in truly addressing our rental housing crisis as we have into putting into the approving of thousands of market rate units in our city. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. With that, again, it's not a public hearing, so I wanted to close it. With that, council comments, questions. Councilwoman Howard, do you want to start?
Sure, I thought we had to close the public hearing.
It's not a public hearing.
Not a public hearing. Okay, thank you. Yes, I did have a couple of questions for Mr. Baird. Thank you. Mr. Baird, regarding minimum lease terms, can you explain why is government exempt? It says units acquired by city or other agency, governmental agency. Why is that so?
The probable reason would be if there are other requirements of a public funding for another project or a development that may conflict with this requirement. So it would be partially that. The other would be that those are developments where tenants can stay and they're not subject to being displaced, if you will, in general. So there's that exemption. But I think the primary reason to include those types of developments would be just not to conflict with whatever rules and regulations they work under.
Okay, so I hear what you're saying. Okay, I was in the report initially. It said that we were going to be told about any unintended consequences or costs where cities evaluated whether they made the right decision and made any changes. And could you highlight any of that for me? I couldn't find it in the report, other than a couple of sentences. But any of the cities that are in comparison or close to us, did they initiate something other than Mountain View with the ordinance that they passed? Do you have any other examples of unintended consequence that came out of things that they put into place?
I don't know of any others than we talked about in terms of kind of the pushback from tenants and landlords. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you. One thing that came up, we did have a discussion with the California Apartment Association before this, just to give them a heads up about that these policies were coming up, and we did offer to sit down with them. I think conceptually they're fine with these as we move forward. They did have some implementation concerns that they wanted to go over with us. I think one thing is they said sometimes ordinances get too specific. So there was an ordinance that they referenced where it says the size of font and the type of font you need for a minimum lease term, showing that this is a city requirement that you offer this. Well, that becomes really burdensome to smaller property owners as they have to change the font on their, and it just causes a lot of implementation details. So I think they wanted to sit down and give us some feedback over, what burdens have been placed over minor issues that I don't think would affect us from a policy standpoint.
I would imagine that if these were put into place, the city would take on the enforcement by either contracting out or doing it ourselves. Any information from other cities about how cumbersome that becomes or costly?
Trying to differentiate the relocation assistance from the minimum lease terms. From the minimum lease terms are really enforced in a lot of ways. And just as an aside, the apartment association provided Mountain View residents with a form that they could use. But in terms of so let me make sure I understand your question. In terms of the staffing, kind of, where is your?
Well, you've answered one question. I'm glad to see the Tri-County Apartment Association, I would think, would be involved and inform tenants of their rights as far as if they feel they weren't offered a lease term, that they'd know who to report to. So that's a self-enforcing thing. But I guess the relocation assistance would have to have oversight, because you'd want to be sure that the owner is doing the correct thing. So I would imagine that cities have probably contracted out to have this service offered, where we have a group in Redwood City that we contract who I believe, and I'm trying to remember the name of the agency, is Sentinel? Is it Sentinel? Project Sentinel.
Project Sentinel.
So I would imagine it would be an agency such as that would be making sure that complaints that came in, they'd follow up right away and find out if, in fact, these terms were being agreed to.
I'm going to jump in here real quick. It's my understanding that when these come back, actually, as policies, that they will come forward. Could you walk through that with us? That when these come back, they will come through a staff associated cost? Because I think this is a question that I'm guessing a consultant won't know because he doesn't work for the city.
So we have not, as to date, assessed any of the staff time or cost impacts associated with enforcing any of the items that are before you. So that would be the next step. Once we hear from you what you'd like us to pursue, that would be part of the evaluation as well as a legal evaluation of the proposal.
So that, to be very clear, that will be coming back. Okay. All right. Go ahead.
Although I have other questions, but I'll wait.
No.
Because
Go
they
ahead.
may get answered by other people.
Well, no, it's okay. I mean, I'd rather go through, if you've got, I'd rather go through it rather than try and keep track of who's got questions left.
Okay, sure. Under relocation assistance, one of the triggers would not be then at the end of 1 year term, for instance, the landlord raises the rent and the person can't afford to stay there. Is that correct?
That's correct. It would not trigger relocation.
Okay. I didn't see it, so I didn't want to assume that wasn't. And this question may not be for you, but I do wonder why we didn't ask the Housing and Human Concerns Committee to study just cause eviction, because we had so much conversation surrounding it, and we've been asked a million times, as speakers have said, to at least look at it and study and see what other cities are doing. So I guess, not to you, Mr. Baird, but my question would be, is that something that maybe we should have asked Housing and Human Concerns to gather input on, or was there a reason why we didn't? I'll just leave that at that.
Okay. And just to be clear, this information is coming back after we had a meeting and asked it to go back, so it was because we didn't ask them this time around. So I guess we'd have to go back and watch the tape of that meeting, but that was a previous meeting when we didn't. It wasn't that.
No,
This wasn't the consultant for the first round of meetings. This is the consultant for the second round of meetings with the HHCC.
No, I hear what you're saying, Mayor Siebert.
Okay.
I'm just saying that thinking now, listening to the speakers, I'll speak for myself. Maybe I should have asked for further study to be given to those two topics, just to get more information on what other cities are doing and to make a better decision. So I'll just take it on myself.
Councilwoman Borgens?
Thank you. So I have a question, and Aaron, this might be for you. Could you explain, was it, you said Tri-County is who you sat with, or California Apartment Association? Is that the same?
Yeah, they've changed their name.
Okay. Okay, so they are in the business of protecting renters?
They're in the, they represent apartment owners.
Okay.
But
So,
I think the question, they do represent apartment owners, but there were some things that both tripped up apartment owners as well as the tenants. But true, when we're speaking with them, they're speaking from the perspective of the apartment owner.
of the apartment owner. Okay. So I'm not overly concerned about the size of a font when it comes to changing a rental agreement. My main concern is taking care of our tenants and our residents. So I know that could be burdensome and time consuming, and it's a computer highlight and whatever. So seriously, when you go back and talk to them, that to me is not a concern.
Yeah.
The concern we have before us is affordable housing and how we keep our residents currently housed. So I was like, we're worried about a font. Okay.
Yeah. I think it had more to do with what was the city enforcing. So if the
Okay.
city had to go and enforce these minor issues, were they not able to focus on bigger policy issues?
Well, I think I want to make sure when we sit down at the table with them that, and I'm not sure how the rest of my colleagues feel, but that we actually are leading that conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's not them telling us what their industry is doing, because that's changing.
Correct.
So I'd like us to really lead that. Thank you.
Totally.
And then, I'm sorry, Bear. Okay, sorry, just lost it. Thank you, Aaron. So when I listened back to the meeting that we had, the joint meeting we had, I clearly heard this council, several of us said that we wanted to research everything. We wanted more research on a lot of this stuff. There were several of us that pinpointed what we didn't. One of the ones that did clearly fall off for research and action was the rent increase moratorium. That was taken off our list. But the rest was pretty much balanced between action and research. And when I played it back, that's the same thing I got. So I thought I heard you earlier say that there were only a couple of things that came back. And when I did the tallying, it was, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 almost got combined, and then 9. And we all kind of supported either action or research. So I would really like to see that happen, the research that we recommended. And I am a little disappointed to see that we're now taking off the inclusionary zoning discussion. I know there's some legal ramifications, but I really want to keep it in front of us at all times. I can see we can't take action on it now, and I get the legal, the loop, the problems right now with that, but I don't want to lose sight of that.
Absolutely, and I think you'll be able to see those as we move forward with plans like the El Camino Corridor Plan, where there's the potential to have an inclusionary housing through different zoning measures that aren't actually an inclusionary housing ordinance.
Great, perfect, thank you. And then I was glad to see that there was a discussion regarding how long a tenant is in their unit. When you flip it, you could say you don't want someone there a year and then saying, "Oh, I can get all this moving." I think there's a balance here. I'm a little concerned when the unit's going to be renovated and then someone's going to be relocated, either temporary or others, and then they can go, excuse me, they can go back in, but it might cost them a lot more. I'd like to have a discussion on how we can work with that, because we can relocate you here, so we will bypass all that relocation. Is that a discussion, or we can relocate you, or we can financially relocate you someplace else? So is that part of the discussion? In other words, if the owner says, we're going to move you to this unit as we upgrade your unit, so we don't have to pay you relocation fees, but we'll let you come back in. It's going to cost you more. Is there a loophole here? I mean, do you understand what I'm...
I know what you're asking. I think just, you have to think about, so you're saying like, would an owner move somebody into a temporary residence and then say, okay, you can come back now, but it's going to cost 5 times as much. But I think you have to also consider, I mean, this is just me talking, but I think you have to also consider there's a cost to the owner to move you into a temporary residence as well, which at a minimum is going to be like 3 months, which is what you're going to get anyway. So I can't.
Okay, I see. So
you know
they
what I
could
mean?
give
Like
the
you're going to have to
option.
still
Okay.
spend the money.
Okay, so but they could have the option.
But I want to clear. Hold on. Can you go back a screen? Because I think actually, if you're talking about still under the existing lease, because they can't break. In other words, if they temporarily relocate you, if they come in and go, hey, we want to upgrade your kitchen, so go live in this unit for a month and you come back. But if you're under a 1-year lease, they can't bring you back and charge you more because you're under a lease.
No, but the statement here was they could raise.
No,
So that was after your lease.
can we clarify
was
that?
up.
Because I didn't hear that at all.
That was after your lease was up, correct?
The way the committee talked about it is that each time the lease is renewed, then you would have to offer that new time frame for the lease.
Right.
But only at the end of that.
Let me. I am gonna jump in here because we're talking about two different things. It says right here the exemption, temporary displacement. Let's see, exemptions. 1, 2, 3, 4 columns over. Temporary displacement due to remodeling and renovations where tenants are provided alternative on housing site. That's an exemption for relocation existence, but it doesn't say when they come back that they'll be charged more because they're still under a lease. You can't break a lease. Is that correct? Yeah. So that's if so. I'll give you an example. I think of where this works out. So if your landlord discovered that you had dry rot in your bathroom and your toilet was about to fall through the floor, which is actually real, and they came in and said, "All right, here's the deal. It's a 1-bathroom house. You can't live here because we've got to gut the bathroom and fix it all." If you're under a lease and you're paying $2,000 a month, and they go, "All right, you got to go live over here." They don't pay you to go live over there. They will pay. There's other laws that require them to let you go. It's like when your house gets tented. I've had this happen to me. They have to put you up in a hotel for a couple of days while you do that. When you come back, you get the place back at the original rent because you're under a lease. The exemption there is the next column where it says end of lease. Right. Okay. So if you're still under a lease, the lease is still the law. That we're not subverting lease law. Yeah.
Okay, so then they would have an option if it was after their lease was up and they, because in the conversation it talked about relocating them within the unit. So that would be a conversation at the end of their lease.
Not necessarily. When I mean, if it's within the lease, then it's
Okay,
it's
got
covered.
it. That's fine.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Right.
Okay, then keep this slide up one more. Could you explain to me what mobile home park conversion would be? Just so I'm clear what that is.
These were some of the conditions that were included in the Menlo Park and the Mountain View ordinances. I think it's just because mobile homes have a separate kind of category that they would be exempt, much like maybe other specific types of uses.
Is that basically because we don't govern mobile homes? Is that
I think
I don't want to lose.
Can we get a legal interpretation? Because there's a separate state law governing
Yes.
mobile home parks.
Yes.
And that's exactly what I was going to say.
Okay.
Thank you, Mayor. So they're already protected under state law, and whenever there is a closure or a conversion, the property owner who is doing the conversion or closing will have to follow that state law. So it makes sense for HHCC to make that recommendation to the city.
Exactly. I knew they were under state law. I just wanted to make sure that's what that was. Okay, thank you.
Okay, Councilwoman Mazur.
Thank you. Quickly, thank you to HHCC. I know when we had this study session, it was a little bit, we sort of went back and forth on some different items. And so I appreciate you guys thinking through all of them and then coming back with your recommendations on the ones that you thought were appropriate for the time. So thank you for spending the time on doing that. I do have a couple of sort of questions about how we're thinking about this. So we have in one section, we have units 3 or less exempted, and in the other one we have units 5 or less exempted. And I was wondering what the thinking was about having 2 different apartment sizes and the different potential policies.
I will speak for the committee as I give
I'll
this
watch
answer.
them to see if they're nodding. when you say
Make
that.
sure they agree with me. I think my interpretation would be that since the relocation assistance was a monetary requirement, that the larger developments, in other words, 5 or more, had a greater, if you will, size and capability to handle that cost. With the minimum lease terms, I think it was more a paperwork type of issue. So I think the committee felt that offering those minimum lease terms to as many people as possible was a good idea, and they felt it was acceptable down to the 3 or more units, because it was just related to paperwork and not a significant.
Yeah, so that actually brings up another question that I have, which is I've rented many places in my life, apartments and houses, and I'm just curious. You mentioned that some of the feedback you got was smaller landlords had said the cost of paperwork for a 1-year lease was greater. Do you have any sense of what that actually is?
Well, I think the concern was across the board that the minimum lease requirement or ordinance requirements put a paperwork burden on the smaller landlords.
To just offer a lease at all?
Well, if they were offering you have to offer the lease, and there's a way you have to offer the lease.
Oh, I see.
And then you have to document.
I see.
And all of that. So
I see.
I think it's attached to that as other kind of paperwork.
All right, that's helpful. Thank you. Let me see. So I wanted to follow up on Councilmember Howard's question about the city, about government agencies and cities being exempted from offering leases. And what kinds of rules, and I don't know who this is the right question for, so I'm going to look all around. What kinds of rules and regulations might make it difficult for, say, the city we're we're administering low-income housing? Generally, we contract with other agencies to do that. So what would make it difficult or impossible for us to participate in minimum lease terms?
I'll just take a stab at it and then invite certainly the city attorney to comment. But in another community where I have worked, the city has owned property which it has leased or used as either employee housing or for some specific public purpose. So it wasn't a general purpose, available to anybody in the community. It wasn't a situation where it was like other kinds of rental housing. So there was a specific reason that they bought it and for which they provided it as housing. Okay. So it's a really unique and unusual circumstance. Okay. And here, I don't think we have anything analogous or any plans to have any city-owned rental or housing.
Yeah. Okay.
Would that be like rent? Like I know a city reasonably close to us, just south of us, owned a home that they owned a home that their city manager lived in, because I knew him when he lived there, and so a house like that they wouldn't be required to offer. Of course, that's only one house, so it wouldn't matter anyways.
Right.
So that's kind of strange, but.
Right, it's that kind of situation, or in the community that I was in, it was actually a building inspector who happened to live in that home. So it could just be a different kind of purpose.
Another example that did happen here in Redwood City is where if the city purchases property and it's currently occupied by residential tenants, we have state relocation requirements. It makes sense that we would be exempted from our own local regulations, very similar to what just happened for the
Jardín de Niños. Yeah, I'd forgotten about that, even though I'd mentioned that earlier. Yeah, okay. Okay.
Okay. I mean, that makes sense on the one hand, and then on the other hand, we're still talking, those are still sort of in single-family units, which are exempted, right?
No, so that was multiple units.
Multi? Oh, okay.
Exactly.
Okay. All right.
So maybe one way to clarify, if you wanted to provide this kind of direction, would be to say circumstances where there isn't a higher level of law that applies, such as mobile home parks or other state law.
I think that's a great.
Yeah,
Then
I think
it
that
would be exempt from the local.
Yeah, I think that would be good, because what I wouldn't want to have happen is that we say, you private apartment owners, you guys all have to give people a year lease, but we're the city, so we're going to say you can live here for a month. We'll let you know next month if you can stay. You know, I don't think we would do that, but I think we should be held to the same standard if we're going to own multifamily units.
I think it's a great point.
If I may, one thing, if I can, I think that's a great suggestion, and maybe we'll think about how we can bring something with those types of regulations. But there are instances where the city can find it in its best interest to purchase property in order to, let's say, maintain the affordability.
Right.
Well, once it purchases property, that property owner becomes our tenant.
Right.
And then we have to go through terminating that holdover tenancy that ends up occurring. So there are, I mean, I'm just thinking off the top, but there are actually quite a few instances where the city couldn't find itself in this situation. So we'll just want to think about those things as we create the ordinance.
Okay. Well, I mean, I guess I would just ask for that consideration then, to think about how do we do it in a way that holds us to the kinds of standards that we're asking other people to live up to. So on that note, and I'll just say one other thing, which is, Councilmember Borgens, you were sounding like you weren't totally clear on this whole like font size question. I think the issue on that was frequently, well, I don't know if it's frequently, so I'll just say sometimes, you know, when cities pass ordinances, they put in a lot of detail that makes it difficult to comply with an ordinance. And so you typically in a policy would want to stay at a higher level, so that you're not getting into this regulation of like, and I think the concept behind that is like, if you put it in a really big font, then people know that this is required. And if you put it in a little, I mean, you think about your credit notices, right? There were a lot of federal changes required about how you got your credit notices and how they were worded, et cetera. So I think it's just trying to stay out of that and really keep to the point of any kind of ordinance that we would want, which is that people are given an opportunity to have a year lease if that's what they want. And so for me, just my feedback on these recommendations, I would like to see us move forward with that particular option. I think it's appropriate to provide some flexibility, and if people want a 6-month lease for whatever reason, they're here for a short time for whatever reason, that they have the opportunity to either have a 6-month or a month-to-month, but at a minimum, but that they're required to be offered a year lease to begin with. However, the policy is written, but
It's basically
you can't circumvent it by saying like, yeah, you just get month to month.
right. Yeah, it would be written so that the landlord at each time the lease is renewed or the first time must offer either the month-to-month, 6-month, or the 1 year, and the decision is up to the tenant to choose which one
Right.
they want. If they negotiate something separate, then they both have to come to agreement.
Yeah. So however that gets written. And then same on the relocation assistance. I think it's a good recommendation. I'd like to see us move forward with further study of that and understand what might be possible for us to put into place. I know there's lots of different points of consideration, but I would like us to at least move forward to see what's possible. And then I would just say, moving forward, I do think that CAA, the California Apartment Association, can help us if we move forward on these ordinances with reaching out to the landlords, making sure that they understand the requirements of the city. Some landlords own properties in multiple cities, and we want them to know what we are saying here in Redwood City. And so I know that one of their goals is to reach out to their members, and so to make sure that their members understand what we're doing in Redwood City. So thank you.
Councilmember G.
Thank you, Mayor Siebert. First, I want to thank Housing and Human Concerns Committee for all the hard work. And please don't misinterpret some of our dialogue as you didn't do a good job. You did a great job with a very difficult subject, and you took back what was the result of the study session and I didn't count, I don't know, Councilmember Borgen, see if you counted, but we had a number of speakers that evening also on a wide spectrum. And so this is never an easy issue given the housing crisis in the region, not only in Redwood City, but you did what the council asked you to do, and thank you for that. In general, I'm very supportive and want to move forward, but as staff dives deeper into the details, and as this comes back, some food for thought. As Councilmember Mazur said, on one level, I think there's 3 units or more, and the other item, 5 units more. Can't we just pick a number like 4 and just say, I believe in simple, so I don't have to remember one number for this and a number for that. So maybe it could be 4 units or more, and both ordinances apply, whatever. Or 5. Yeah, just pick a number just from a simplicity standpoint so it's easier to communicate. With regard to the minimum lease terms, I agree completely. The landlord and the tenant, whether it's a new tenant or ongoing one, needs to have flexibility. Month to month, a 6-month, a 12-month, or whatever they can mutually agree upon. I think that's very reasonable. But as you dive deeper into this, some things to think about. I think Councilmember Howard asked the question about government organizations. That night, we also heard, I think, at least a couple speakers talk about Section 8 and the difficulty of obtaining that. And I don't want to layer another set of bureaucracies on top of already potentially unwieldy bureaucracy like Section 8. So I don't know how this works with Section 8, but I would like to keep it as simple as possible. And not make this overly complicated for the few Section 8 owners or landlords that are providing that. From a lessons learned standpoint, I think one of the lessons learned from these other cities that have adopted this is to take a close look at the lease, and if I'm leasing an apartment, what my obligations are or requirements if I sublease, if I go travel somewhere for 6 months or 3 months. I think those are 2 different occupants. I think the 612 and whatever at the landlord-lessee relationship is one thing, and the tenant and the sub-lessee is a whole different relationship. And so let's be mindful of what that might look like or not look like and whatever council's desires are. But from my council perspective, those are 2 very different relationships that should be kept separate. Let me see where else I want to go in here. With regard to relocation, I think one of the interesting items in the relocation, which I am supportive of in general, is the requirement or that 3 months rent be provided at the median and market rent for a similar size unit. I don't know where that comes from. And if I'm a small landlord, how do I get that information? I mean, I don't want to have to commission a market survey every time I'm faced with a situation where I have to pay relocation. So I don't know if the committee has another metric that they can look at, whether HUD or some other fact-based organization, so that it's not subject to the whims of the market. Where if I'm thinking about renovating a unit or paying relocation, I can plan for it within reason rather than have to do a market survey and figure out what a 2-bedroom is going for in April of 2018 and how do I build that into my renovation pro forma and things like that. So just some food for thought as this comes back. And then just as importantly, as the deeper dive occurs and the resource allocation requirements as well as the legal review occurs, if this really does require enforcement from the city, how do we pay for it and what some funding mechanisms might be to help pay for it? We just went through a budget presentation and approval saying, we're going to be resource constrained. I don't know if it's forever, but at least for the foreseeable future. And how do we take on something new with no resources and find a way to fund it? So that's got to be a part of the conversation moving forward. Let's see. The other item then is also, I think it's on page 9 of the staff report, where we talk about there's a term, I think this is ready to go, when we talk about impact fee strategy. I think I mentioned this to Ms. Diaz this morning or this afternoon, is that just that needs to be kind of walked backwards a little bit in terms of funding commitments. If I'm building something or developing something, I don't want to wait till I go out to bid to know my funding commitments are there. Particularly if I've got other funding partners like a bank. They want to know the commitments are already there earlier than when you go out to bid. So that probably just needs some work to go backwards a little further on that. Let's see. With regard to that section, I think we are already doing many things, as I think Mayor Siebert said that in the study session. We are already partnering, if I remember correctly, with MidPen and HIP on acquiring 2 apartment buildings and to keep them at affordable. And I believe conversations are underway with St. Francis Center to do the same thing. So again, at the deeper dive, particularly at the legal review, to make sure there aren't any unintended consequences, as we would be at least a part owner or lender to those 3 projects if they were to, just how this might work when we're a partner, a financial partner with a project like that, those 3. So I think those are my comments, Mayor Siebert.
Hey, Vice Mayor Bain.
Thank you. A question or two, and then I'll address the issues. The first question I have, and this may answer the second question as well. You mentioned, Mr. Baird, something about paperwork, like the amount of paperwork involved for smaller landlords. Was that referring to that font size issue, or is there some other issue related to that?
Well, this was a comment by City of Mountain View staff that was what they heard from the smaller landlords, that the requirements for developing and confirming and documenting this whole process required paperwork that was impacting them.
Was that referring to the leasing, or was that referring to the relocation ordinance?
That was the leasing, the minimum lease requirement, not the pushback on the relocation.
Okay. Well, anyone who knows me knows I'm not a fan of paperwork, so I imagine that we'll find a way to streamline that if we implement that, and we'll do it differently than Mountain View did. All right, that answers my questions. Thank you. First of all, I really want to thank the Housing and Human Concerns Committee. I know that this has been a difficult task where you've been bombarded by people with very strong opinions on both sides of the issue. It hasn't been easy. And don't feel discouraged by anything that you've heard tonight or otherwise. I think these are great recommendations, and they're very much in line with what we asked you to do. I would like to make it very clear for the record, there was a comment that the HHCC was directed not to look at rent stabilization or just cause eviction. That is not true. Anyone who goes back and looks at the public meetings, no one here at the dais ever said that. I can tell you that was never said in the mayor or vice mayor meeting. What we asked the HHCC to do was to look at best practices from other cities. And we asked specifically for alternatives to rent control. And the reason why we did that was because no one on this dais has expressed an appetite for rent control in Redwood City. And I will say again, personally, I don't support rent control, and I say that based on personal experience. And just to give you one example, I lived in Berkeley, I went to school there, and I competed in a very tough housing market where I was competing for a very small number of units and paying my own way through school and paying twice as much as friends of mine who were getting a free ride from their parents because there was no means testing for rent control. It didn't work for many of us. It worked for the lucky few who were able to receive it. It didn't work for a lot of us. And I've asked rent control advocates, or the more popular term is rent stabilization, to come to us with ordinances that work and show us how they work. Show us the data that shows how they work. I'll be very interested to see what happens in Mountain View with the initiative they passed. Now, just cause eviction, some of us have actually dug into this quite a bit. We're not just shooting from the hip up here. I spent a lot of time with the Community Legal Services of East Palo Alto, digging into these issues, trying to find some sort of a happy medium here. Rent stabilization or rent control sounds like a great silver bullet. So does just cause eviction. just cause eviction, I'm sure the city attorney would back me up. I don't want to put words in her mouth, but it's only effective, it only works if there's a rent control ordinance or rent stabilization ordinance in place. Since there's no appetite here on the dais, and anyone who disagrees with me can disagree with me on this, for rent control, we're not asking you to waste time looking at just cause eviction. Now, that said, the Housing and Human Concerns Committee can look at whatever issues it wants. And if people want to come up and talk to the committee about that and the committee wants to discuss it, you're free to do that. But I just wanted to clarify those issues since I've heard them repeated, and things have a way of taking on life their own once they get repeated. I'm glad I had a chance to do that, and I'm really glad that we have such a great committee that made a good set of recommendations. I don't see this as the stopping point. I see this as a jumping off point. Now, a couple of other points I want to clarify as well. So inclusionary zoning, we don't have the power currently to do inclusionary zoning on rental units. That's state law. We just don't have that. Kevin Mullen has a bill that's working its way through Sacramento that may change that, in which case we would be able to do that. So what we can do in the short term is we can work with developers and negotiate with them and try to get them to include below market units into their properties. And that's what I've really been pushing for, in particular because they have the ability to acquire land much better than we do. So we need them to be partners. So if there are any developers who are listening to this, we want you to partner with us on acquiring the land and building affordable units into those developments. We have done a lot of creative things with partnerships. The Stafford Street project was on the agenda tonight. That was a very creative option where a private owner came to the city and said, will you purchase this, and then work with Mid-Penn to operate it. I don't want the city to be landlords. Therefore, the conversation about our rental policy is hopefully going to be irrelevant for the foreseeable future, because we're going to work with nonprofit partners who will keep those units affordable in perpetuity. I hope we can do more projects like the Stafford Street project. That's an innovative project. And I would like the HACC to continue looking at innovative things that other cities are doing. What are some other great ideas that you can bring to the table for the discussion? Because we're certainly open to those. Thank you.
Okay. Councilwoman Howard.
First of all, I want to thank Vice Mayor Bain for summarizing so well that I really had forgotten, quite frankly, some of the conversation we had, and I really appreciate your summary because it really clarified it for me. I think what I was wondering was, could we do a just cause eviction without rent stabilization? Because for the record, I've said the same thing, that I am not in favor of rent stabilization for many of the reasons you have in a different location, New York, but the same thing about competing and no oversight on the rent control. However, what I didn't know is that just cause eviction is tied in very closely with rent stabilization. So thank you for doing that research and getting that information, because I was going to ask, should we be studying just cause eviction on its own, for its own merits? Is anyone doing that? But apparently there's a risk in doing it that way, that they really need to be tied together. So thank you for doing that. I really appreciate it. And also thank you to the Housing and Human Concerns Committee. Having been on that committee, I know the amount of hours that you put in, and I really appreciate the report was excellent. You were very thorough. And thank you for listening to the community and having them at your meetings and taking the time to do extra meetings, because it really took a lot of your personal time, and I really appreciate that. Lastly, I have a HEART meeting this week, which is the Housing Endowment and Regional Trust. And Vice Mayor Bain mentioned that we're working with nonprofits now. We're also acquiring or working with landlords of multi-unit apartments and working with them to rehab their buildings and giving them low-interest loans in return for guaranteed affordability for the tenants for a number of years agreed upon. And what I'm going to talk to HEART about is, would they consider working with us on helping us do more of this? And I'll report back to you on, right now they don't do much of this. They do mostly new construction or home buyer assistance. But they're looking for new ideas. And as I'm sitting here listening, I'm thinking, this is an idea that I think will really, get their enthusiasm up, because it'll create housing that's already there. It's just rehabbing it, making it clean and safe, and making sure it's affordable for many years to come. And I'd like to see HART become a partner with us in making more of these transactions happen. And when I get that information, I might like to consider having the Housing and Human Concerns Committee look into HART and the work they do and study some of their projects and see how we can possibly do more of the rehab building in Redwood City. So thank you, Mayor Bain, Vice Mayor Bain again, and to the Housing and Human Concerns Committee. Really appreciate your work.
Thank you. I said some thank yous before, but I hope that you'll go back. I know there are others that couldn't be here tonight. I hope you'll go back and share with them our pleasure with the work. It was extra work. I know you got paid all that overtime. I don't know how you'll spend all the money, but kidding, they're volunteers. So thank you for that. I'm going to cover just a couple of points. A few of these things have been mentioned, but I think a couple of them are worth mentioning again. One, there's a lot of things that were mentioned about the number of units. My question is that per site, per landlord? How big? I mean, if it's things about market rate, things about defining special needs. And I'm going to wrap all that up. When this comes back, I think it needs to have a very robust set of definitions. When we say something in the ordinance, we need to point to what that means. When we define a special need, point to exactly what that means. When we point to a market rate or where and how much relocation, we've just got to have because where these things, I see these things become problems later on, is when we short circuit the list of definitions at the beginnings of the ordinance or somewhere in there contained in, so that it's very clear to landlords. And I think that is one of the great things, and one of the things that the work of the California Apartment Association through Tri-County does, and that is providing helpful information about, just make sure, you hear this all the time from developers, from landlords, just tell me very clearly what the rules are. So I'm going to be looking at this with the eyes of making sure there's no ambiguity about what it is. To that point about definitions, I do want to offer something, if it would be acceptable, but if you'll go back, forget going back. I know it's in there. There was a group of special needs. I would really like to see veterans added to that list. It's an easy one to determine. It is extremely easy to figure out whether a person was a veteran or not. It is the type of housing. I know this area. We are not. We don't have a lot of we're not near a big base or anything like that. But I know we have veterans, and I believe that they should be one of the special protected and receive the extra month of relocation assistance, which is where that was. The thing about inclusionary zoning, interestingly enough, although the state is working on that, let's face it, we do have in the place where we've really only built housing, we have inclusionary zoning. It's called the Downtown Precise Plan. We added that. We had it to begin with, and then it got taken away because of the RDA, went away, and then we brought it back, and we still have a 15%. It doesn't mean that within precise plans, as Mr. Ackman mentioned, moving forward, that we can't do in precise plans inclusionary, or that we can't work with developers to do that. So whereas we don't have it and we don't call it inclusionary zoning, we have that ability, and we have worked very successfully, including in the Downtown Precise Plan, to have that 15% set aside. So I think that is still that's still out there. We've worked with developers, and I think we can continue to work with developers. The one thing I'm a little concerned about the flexibility. I'm all for flexibility. What I want to make sure is that flexibility isn't used as a club, and by that I mean if the two of us are competing for an apartment, and up front I say that I'm willing to go to a month to month, or I'm willing to go to a 6 month, and he says I'm not willing to go to a year, I can tell you who's going to get the apartment. I am. So I think we've got to be very careful with that flexibility. I get it. I love when we don't get in the way of good, healthy negotiations, and I'm all for that, because I think it's great. Somebody may agree to a 2-year or a 3-year or a 4-year lease. I think that's fabulous. But I think we've got to be very careful when we say, well, you could also get a month to month, because I could see if we're not very careful with that, it will be used as a way to make decisions about who that's given to. I just know that will happen, and we'll be, again, without those lack of specific definitions, we'll be right back here. And the last thing is I'll be very interested to hear about the cost to Redwood City, because it is important when we make these decisions. This is a very big and very complex city, and becoming more and more complicated. That budget that you don't have to hold it up again, but that budget is a great deal of complexity, and I think we've got to make these decisions with our eyes wide open, and make these decisions knowing exactly what it will cost the city when it comes to staff. So I'll look forward to that coming back, as well as how do we pay for that. This is affordable. This has worked in the area of affordable housing. So if you're interested, whether there's a recommendation to use some, not all, but some affordable housing monies to pay for some of these items from a staff perspective. And I think we've got to look very carefully at that. With that, I appreciate the comments said by Vice Mayor Bain around rent control. He is 100% correct about the work that was done. We, our HHCC, quite frankly, any board, commission, or committee that doesn't do this full time, we want to maximize their work. When you have 7 people saying, this is not something we want to take up and look at right now, I'd rather maximize their work around being effective. And this is this is extremely effective. We have not gotten this far in a long time, and I'm happy look forward to it coming back. So we'll look forward to it coming back in the future. So thank you. Okay.